So I think we can all agree that liking anime at all is fairly autistic. But just how autistic is it? Over the last few weeks, I've been working on my unified theory of anime autism. I've created a leveling system to judge just how autistic different anime are on the basis of who enjoys them and why. I've been running this by a whole lot of people, and everybody I've talked to seems to agree with me on the general placement of different shows, as well as the placement of themselves within the autism ranking chart. So, are you ready to find out how autistic you are based on your taste in anime? You're in the right place. The basis of my theory is that there are 7 different levels of autism, and depending on how far you go down this scale, it will dramatically affect what kind of stories you are most inclined to enjoy. So, what defines a story as being more autistic? Well, the number one thing is database, living in the database, whoa! You may have heard of Hiroki Azuma's book, Otaku Database Animals. This theory that otaku are people who are obsessed with databases, people who are obsessed with categorization. And my theory basically plays off of this database aspect by suggesting that the more the appeal of something resembles a spreadsheet, the more autistic it is. The easiest way for us to truly understand this, though, will just be to go down the levels, keep getting deeper and deeper, and see just how autistic does anime get. So for starters, are there any anime that are not autistic at all? I would say that there are some anime that skirt the lines of being not autistic at all. I think that if you enjoy anime at all, there's probably some level of autism, just because a lot of the innate appeal of anime is in its appeal to those more autistic parts of human thought. There has to be a reason that traditional mainstream media does not appeal to you. And anime, nowhere in the world is mainstream media, not even really in Japan, outside of shows that are made for kids or families. There have been anime that have been more mainstream, stuff like One Piece or Dragon Ball, but we also have to understand that being at level 1 autism is fairly common. It's not as though there's only a tiny percentage of the population that has any autism at all. This is a sliding scale. So there is a huge population of level 1 autism, which is not that different from having no autism. However, if your predilections lead you away from the most mainstream media, it probably means that there's a little bit more of a database element to the way you think. Regular-ass normies really don't even care that much about ongoing narratives. They don't care that much about complex storytelling. They mostly consume media just as a way to kill time, without giving it that much thought, without really having to, care about it on this more intimate personal level, because they're not seeking connection through media in the way that other people are. If you need this kind of stuff to relate to, it means that there is something a little bit more distant between you and the rest of society. And in particular, most of the strengths of anime in being alternative media are the ways that it turns away from those more mainstream ideas. It's very rare that you have any anime that doesn't have anything that appeals to more autistic people. To name a couple of shows that I think are very much level 1 autism, Death Note might be one of the least autistic anime that's out there. There are some elements of it that maybe appeal more to the database brain. For instance, for me, reading Death Note, one of the things that fascinated me was all the rules that are present in the story. The fact that it's just an ongoing narrative at all, in fact, is, I think, just slightly autistic. Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood, another example of a show that's not particularly autistic. These are shows I'd probably give like a 0.5 on the autism scale. And these are some of the most broadly appealing, most popular anime of all time, because they reach that much larger base of people who only have the slightest tinge of the tism. If I had to categorize where anime starts going as you move further down the autistic spectrum, it moves further and further away from the central focus being on strong central storytelling and just being an entertaining, coherent narrative and more into metatextual elements. The more autistic something is, the more it has to say about the medium or genre that it comes from. The more it is playing off the idea that you would have already consumed, memorized, and cared about other works within the medium. It also means that there is more to think about and talk about outside of that central storyline. There are elements that you can keep track of and sort of create a mental database in your mind. So for instance, Dragon Ball Z is a show that can be enjoyed not very autistically. You can just enjoy it as a show about a bunch of big dudes beating the shit out of each other. However, if you start getting into the power levels, you start caring about tracking the power levels, comparing them, talking about power levels with different people, when you get to the point where you start to speculate who could beat up whom, and then start thinking about like which characters from this show would be able to fight characters from other shows, that's where the autism starts to come in. Dragon Ball Z, I would say, can get up to like level 1 to 1.5 on the autism scale based on if you enjoy it in that way. Now, in light of that, I will also say that people anywhere on this autism scale can enjoy stuff anywhere else so long as the way that they're enjoying it is more or less autistic. However, I do think that there is a likelihood that you will not really be that into stuff unless it falls within like at least 1 point of your autism. So let's say if you, like me, are autism level 3, you're most likely to enjoy autism level 3 works. Maybe autism level 2, maybe autism level 4. You will be further disconnected from level 1, further disconnected from level 5. But you still might be able to appreciate those things on some level, especially if you can fit them into a broader context or find things to like about them outside of the central narrative element of the story. One Punch Man is a perfect example of a flat level 1 autism show because of the fact that it plays off of tropes. It inherently is a commentary on the genre and medium that it's a part of, and it has very broad appeal, but it's never going to truly make sense to you if you don't have any context surrounding it, if there's no meta in your understanding of the story. But because of the fact that the meta it's commenting on is primarily found in stories that are on the less autistic side, the kind of stuff that runs in Shonen Jump, which doesn't usually tend to have that autistic of elements to it. They can be enjoyed in more autistic ways, but again, like something like One Piece, you don't have to be that autistic to enjoy One Piece, but you can get really autistic about One Piece and then make the potty cast. Likewise with Hunter x Hunter. That show gets a little bit more autistic, especially if you start learning about Nen and you can actually keep track of it. You're getting a little closer to level 2. But there's more ways to be autistic than just logistical ways. It's not always just about the pure spreadsheet, like mathematical readings of shows. You can have a more emotional side to your autism. And I think that shows that aren't autistic at all would normally feature characters who are just acting in straightforward, understandable ways that most people could relate to. As soon as you start having characters who have oddly specific, maybe fetishized personalities or emotional scenarios that appeal to you in ways that they're less realistic, but speak to something more core about your own personality in a categorical kind of way, it's a little bit more autistic. I think of something like Tokyo Ghoul or any of the like edgy stuff that, that teenagers tend to really like. That kind of stuff has an autistic appeal that's less about the complexity of the narrative and more about the specificity of the types of emotions that are present in the story that you wouldn't really get from a story where people are just acting like people. When we start heading towards level 2 autism is where we get shows like Steins Gate. This is a show that heavily comments on the medium that it's a part of, the culture surrounding it, and some of those elements I would say are even more closer to level 3. But the show kind of puts that stuff in the background. That's the kind of stuff that you can enjoy in a level 3 kind of way, but it's a show that I think is most appreciated by level 2 autists. And at level 2, that's when you start getting really into anachronic storytelling, time travel, stories that force you to keep up with more things, that have, again, a denser inner meta, more just layers to it, things to keep track of. Quentin Tarantino movies are generally level 2 autism, but they can also be enjoyed in a level 3 autism kind of way. And at level 3 is where the meta starts to kind of overtake the actual storytelling. As we go further down this chart, people care less and less about telling a straightforward, compelling story and more about those metatextual elements. If your favorite thing about a Tarantino movie is all of the film history that it calls back to and placing it in this context of film history, you're probably about as autistic as Quentin Tarantino himself is, which is to say, level 3. Neon Genesis Evangelion is a level 3 autism show, and a lot of these shows tend to feature more autistic characters. This is still at a point where telling a compelling central narrative matters, but it starts to take a real backseat to the meta text, to stories that, aren't really that linearly satisfying, that take a lot more diversions, that are maybe a little bit more shandified. They're going in different directions, exploring more of the world, and not so focused on whatever is in the dead center of the story. The Monogatari series, great example of level 3. Hugely metatextual, lots of wordplay, not as much central storytelling, more just wasting time with characters in this world, and those characters are built out of these database elements. This is where we start to get characters who feel more and more like they are cobbled together from different ideas that exist within the medium. They less feel like regular people and more like specific ideas. Once we reach level 4, this is where central narrative really starts to move into the background. It still needs to be there for these people to truly love a series, probably, but they're much more focused on the database elements. This is where we start getting into things like the Fate franchise or the Index franchise, where just the complexity of ideas, the sheer number of characters, the sheer amount of world building really goes out of control. If you're somebody who is just reading wikis or writing wikis of your shows, you really have this very specific characters that you're a huge fan of because of whatever tropes they represent. I mean, this is really where we're getting into database animal territory. Highly otaku works, I think, tend to fall in, level 4 autism. And so, we're really getting farther and farther away from the light of society, farther and farther away from realism in our characterization, from straightforwardness in our storytelling. We're really starting to look like a spreadsheet. And level 5, then, is where we just go completely out of control. This is where conventional linear storytelling no longer really matters. If you're enjoying stuff like Can Cole, this is where you fall, where it's just about having as many fucking characters built entirely on spreadsheet elements as possible. The current Boat Girls show is a good example. Shows like this, when you watch the first episode, tend to introduce 50 characters up front, tons of factions, lots of world building way before story even becomes a consideration. Now, something interesting also happens the further down the autism scale we go, which is that authorial intent matters less and less as well. The more autistic you are, the more you will find your own fun in the stories that you consume because of the fact that you can just read more into what's happening. At level 1 autism, you're more likely to enjoy a story that is compelling in and of itself. At level 5, it doesn't matter so much that the story is compelling as that it appeals to you in some kind of raw, visual, often way. This is where, shows that really live or die on their character designs, or, people who are just into something because it impacts them immediately, and then they find a way to love it even more, often by creating their own sort of existence within it. So all throughout this scale you can find fan fiction, but someone who's level 2 autism probably cares a lot more about keeping everything canonical, keeping everything true to the original story, and only barely venturing out into connected ideas, whereas somebody who's at level 5 autism will completely fabricate their own version of the story, take characters in totally different directions, or or possibly really obsess over every individual detail of what was present in the canon and extrapolate on it much further. Once we get to level 6 autism, this is where we start to enter the realm of lower functioning, where you probably don't even have as easy of a time relating to society or traditional stories in the first place, and most of what you're getting out of stories is what you're reading into them because you're reading so much into everything. This is Chris Chan tier. This is the level where your inner universe overtakes the appreciation of the original work, where it becomes more of your own thing than, something that you relate to other people who are consuming the story as well. At this point, your conception of the story is more, born from your autism than from what is actually present and intended by the author. Getting to level 7 is where we reach a point where you are barely intelligible to regular people. If you are, obsessed with Thomas the Tank Engine as an adult, that's level 7 autism, and that pretty much goes all the way down into the lowest functioning. If you've reached a point where, you don't even connect with what people like about stories at all, you have difficulty even you probably have difficulty communicating in any way if you're at level 7 autism. So that's my autism chart. Now, let's go ahead and just go down a list of anime and place them in various places on this chart so we can get a better sense of exactly where everything falls. Shows like Naruto or Bleach, these are good examples of shows that can easily be enjoyed at level 1 and 2. They're shows that have, somewhat complex narratives that go on for a long time, but you can kind of just enjoy them by just, passively consuming the show. The more you get into all the different factions, if you start identifying with certain villages or, wearing the headbands, that's closer to level 2. The movie Your Name, that movie's interesting because I think it has very good spiking down appeal, where people at no autism or very little will probably be able to enjoy that movie because it is such a straightforwardly entertaining summer blockbuster, easy, readable characters with common emotions, relatable to anybody, just a very easy to appreciate movie. And I think that it starts to break down a little bit in the level 2 category, where I think people at level 2 really care the most about story construction, about all of the different parts, fitting together well. These are people who want their stories to be a compelling, straightforward narrative, but they want it to be airtight. They don't want there to be any, they don't want there to be any missteps along the way, and they're more interested in how complex can a story get while still keeping all of it making sense and realistic and still enjoyable to watch. So for people like that, Kimi no Na wa might start to break down a little bit because they're seeing the plot holes, they're seeing that the structure isn't perfect. As you get to level 3 and 4, however, you start to be more interested in the metatextual elements of the film. It's commentaries about the state of, society in Japan. And granted, you can still appreciate these things at level 1 or 2 autism, but I think that your, ability to love the movie on the basis of these things and to forgive some of the problems that the movie has, that becomes more of a thing the deeper down you go. And granted, depending on your intelligence level, it can override a lot of things that have to do with autism. It might just be that you enjoy things that are that have more complexity just on an intellectual level, but that doesn't necessarily equate to enjoyment. I think that someone like me looks at Your Name and I can appreciate some of the more complex elements of it intellectually, but the movie doesn't do as much for me because it doesn't really have that level 3 autism I'm looking for. Likewise, there are tons of non-autistic or not very autistic movies or shows that I think are good, and I intellectually feel like, oh, that's a well-structured, well-put-together movie, but it's never going to reach me in the same way that something it will if it, something like Ava that has all that richness of metatextual elements to it, the more prominent connection that I feel to the author as compared to, something that's more straightforward. Elfenlied, particularly the manga, I would say is level 5 autism. This is a story that you enjoy because of the database elements in the story. If you're into the fetishes that it represents, if you relate to these incredibly weird, very inhuman, very, based on whatever tropes they embody type of characters, that's the most enjoyment you'll get out of Elfenlied. And granted, there are tons of people who have enjoyed it on some level, especially the anime, just because of how insanely violent it is, which gets your attention. It has things to say about society that are kind of interesting, especially if you're a teenager who's seeing it for the first time and has never really thought about a lot of the crazy stuff in that show. But most regular people are going to think the show is vile and disgusting and bad and just badly written and terrible. But, again, it really has a lot of specific appeal that if you're, viewing it from that more autistic lens, you don't really care about the bad storytelling. You care about the fact that it has characters who embody these things that you relate to or care about. Kill La Kill is a good example of a show that I think occupies like the level 2-3 sort of range, but how much you enjoy it will really depend on which one of those two you are. At level 2 autism, you'll definitely appreciate it as like, something a little bit metatextual in the realm of anime, depending on how much anime you've seen, how many of the references you get, how much you know about, like, what it's playing into, that might factor into your enjoyment, but it is a show that breaks down a little bit on the traditional storytelling kind of scale. It's not very clean, it feels like a mess, a bit of a clusterfuck, and I can see why that would turn a lot of people off. But if you're at level 3 autism and those kind of things don't bother you as much, but you're really interested in just how much thematic depth is packed into the story, how referential it is of the surrounding culture, how much it has, on those deeper layers, then you'll probably enjoy it a lot more. Konosuba, probably a perfect example of like a level 2 autism comedy. Again, a lot of the humor is derived from its placement within the genre. It's playing around with anime tropes, but it also doesn't go so far with that you would need to have seen a ton of shows to understand what it's making fun of. As long as you have a vague understanding of the genre and of anime in general, you can appreciate it, and a lot of the jokes aren't like that crazy fucking, referential. I would definitely say, levels 2 and 3 will probably find just about equal enjoyment of the show. But, the characters, while they have some sorts of database elements, they're not like all about just being this like one cliche so much. And even to the extent that they are, it's for comedic effect. And lampooning those kinds of cliches is less autistic than seriously enjoying them. Another set of works that are good for that sort of tunneling down effect in a similar fashion to the Quentin Tarantino films are the works of Shinichiro Watanabe, such as Cowboy Bebop or Samurai Champloo. These are stories that actually have excellent appeal even to people with very little autism because they do tell compelling, straightforward narratives with complex, realistic characters that, that you could relate to even if you're just like a normal person. But if you want to get really autistic about these shows, there's so much detail, so much metatextual reference, so much extra to get into. I would say these are probably level 2, not as much level 3, but they're bordering on it, just in how much reference there is to surrounding media. But a lot of the surrounding media that they pay homage to is not necessarily that autistic. So it's different from anime, which, a lot of the more autistic anime pay homage to even more autistic anime. So if you're talking about, say, Re:Zero, I would say that's a bit more autistic than Cowboy Bebop because it's still commenting on the medium, but it's commenting on the medium of isekai light novels and pathetic autistic otaku protagonists. Stuff like K-On! And Cute Girls Doing Cute Things shows, these definitely start at level 2 minimum. I don't think you can enjoy these shows if you're not at least level 2 autism, because they don't have compelling storylines. You can find lots of narrative in them in as much as they are character studies. They're certainly about something. They certainly have enriching worlds. Well, the good ones do. And I mean, again, the more autistic you are, the less you really care about how good something is. But in this, I'm putting huge air quotes around good because obviously we're talking about mainstream accepted definitions of what is good. And this is why it's so difficult for these kind of cute girls shows to be accepted in the mainstream, is because the appeal of them is heavily autistic. It's much more categorical, much more database driven, and much more, again, about just not caring so much if there is a compelling central narrative, but getting something out of what you see in the characters. I think that there's a lot of level 2 autists who have sort of been converted to these shows because of level 3 autists who are more innately in tune with them, who will, explain to the level 2 autists what is good about these shows, particularly the best in the genre. So if you're somebody who maybe only really watches like a couple of Cute Girls Doing Cute Things shows, more likely autism level 2. If you're watching all of them, level 3 at least. Pretty much anything based on a visual novel is almost guaranteed to go straight to level 4. Visual novels are just a very autistic mode of consumption because they really do stretch like your need to have something be like automatically compelling. Like, the more autistic you are, the less you probably care about like prose quality in something that you're reading. The more you're able to look at something with not the best art, listen to not the best music. You're more interested in the concepts, the characters, and what happens in the story than how the story is presented to you, which is why it's a lot easier to read, 60 hours of text and like complex branching narratives and keeping track of multiple tabs. If you're somebody who, saves at every single choice in a game, you are autism level 4 at minimum. And none of this, by the way, is to judge people in their media that they like. In fact, part of what I hope to accomplish by making this is to kind of ease people's minds about why they might enjoy something and why, it's so difficult to explain to other people what is enjoyable about the things you like. Why is it that even though you think this story is so compelling and there's so much that you find in it, this other person can't even give it the time of day just because they're stuck on some other element and they're not seeing things the way that you are, because you're taking a different approach to the way that you consume and enjoy things, one that is, again, more driven by the understanding, the categorical idea of what the story you're consuming is, as opposed to the fun or initial upfront enjoyment that you get from watching something that's just entertaining. I mean, if you want me to escape the realm of anime just for a moment, to talk about something like superhero movies, I think that the superhero craze definitely has reached all the way up to normies. Like, normies can watch these movies and just enjoy them as these huge, expensive spectacle pieces. And what they like about these movies is that they look crazy, that there's all this CG, all this stuff happening, sound and light and explosions. And you'll notice that the more autistic people, which, I mean, if you're a film critic, probably at least a little touch of the autism, because, normal people don't give a fuck about how quality something is. Those people tend to complain about the loud, distended climaxes of movies. Autistic people don't like loud noises very much. We are not entertained by that because we're looking for more of the concepts, the interesting thoughts that we get out of the projects. So these movies, they do tend to have a burrowing down effect where they can reach pretty far down the autistic spectrum if you enjoy it for different reasons. If you're somebody who really cares about the ongoing narrative of the movies, maybe you watch all of them, in anticipation of the next Avengers or something like that, that is definitely at least level 1, if not level 2 autism. You're really more concerned about the whole meta-narrative of the films. If you are then caring about them in relationship to the comics and you know, the whole meta of all of comics and the you know, the vast patchwork of what that all represents, that's getting into level 2, closer to level 3, you know. And the more you're noticing all the thematic stuff in the movies, the more you care about, like, you know, how good they are of stories, like in terms of what they present outside of just the immediate flash and fun. It's a little bit, you know, a little bit in the 1 or 2 categories. But there's also appeal even further down, like, again, because these are all part of these gigantic, insanely long-running series that have so much going on, so much history, so much to take in. And the more of that intrigues you about them, the more autistic the intrigue. I don't think Marvel movies generally get to level 4, because I think that at level 4 you probably just think that the movies don't have enough of the database elements, that they just are, you know, you probably watch all of them but don't like most of them, because I think that level 4 is also where we start to get into, like, really crazy consumption. Well, really level 3 is where we get into crazy consumption habits. If you're somebody who, like, wants to categorically know everything about whatever medium you care about, that's level 3 autism right there. Somebody like me who sets about, like, I'm gonna watch every anime ever made, that's level 3. But level 4, that's, like, not even a question. Like, when you get to level 4, you're not thinking, like, oh, I'm gonna make a whole thing out of watching as much anime as possible. You just would do that. You just wouldn't even think about it. You're just going for it, you know? Incidentally, stuff like Magic the Gathering, if you have, like, a totalizing understanding of Magic, that's, like, level 4 autism. It's just so much complexity, so much to memorize, so many different things to understand how they relate to one another. I think that type of card game and strategy games in general, I think, appeal to that, because it requires you to just keep track of tons of shit. It's more spreadsheet-esque. You know, again, visual novels, things like Sengoku Rants, I think is, like, a very level 4 autism appeal. And again, it's not that these things can't appeal upwards. There's lots of different reasons you could like something, especially if it just happens to hit right in your strike zone. But, like, for instance, I might enjoy certain level 4 autism works because I like the character designs, or I really like the particulars of the setting. They appeal to, like, my aesthetic sensibilities, or just concepts that I find interesting. But I probably will struggle with the more autistic side of that, you know, in hampering my enjoyment. Or likewise, if I enjoy, you know, something that's at level 1, I might feel like, well, that was a well-told story, but it didn't give me all the extra shit that I'm looking for, you know? Whereas when we get down to level 5, I really struggle to enjoy level 5 stuff, because it just doesn't have that initial hook, that initial grab of a somewhat, like, relatable and comprehensible storyline for me to latch onto and start following. It just feels like I have to just intake all this raw data right away and just be intrigued by that, be keeping track of all that. Shows like Horizon on the Middle of Nowhere is a great example of a level 5 autism show, or something like Book of Bantora. Like, these are shows that really just hit you with so much out the gate to keep track of, whereas level 4 would be more like, you know, Accelerator or Railgun, where, like, you have to keep track of a lot, but it's still presented in a linear enough fashion and with enough story behind it that you can, you know, reasonably keep up with it. Just as long as, you know, you have enough autism to even initially give a fuck about shows that look like those shows do, which a normie would never give a fuck about. I haven't talked much about level 6, and that's because at level 6, I think your favorite thing is probably Sonic the Hedgehog. And it's because at level 6 autism, again, this is where we get into, like, the lower functioning category. And it's not to say that if you're level 5, you're almost low functioning, not necessarily. Like, intelligence plays a big role in this as well, and I think there's people even at level 6 autism who could, fit into society and have conversations with people, provided that they are intelligent or they grew up in a circumstance where they really learned how to communicate with people. There's lots of strategies that autistic people come up with for how to communicate, how to be understood. There are lots of people who don't recognize themselves as having any form of autism because it might be so benign that they, have just never been made to think about it, or that their interests were close enough to the people around them that it never really mattered. It never made them feel alienated or weird. They just feel like a regular person who just happens to have a little bit more eccentric interests than the other people around them. But at level 6, where it really starts to be lower functioning, you get into the realm where, your obsession with something can just completely redefine it. So, the kind of people who really read super deeply into something like Sonic the Hedgehog, they get initially into it because it is so easily appealing. The character design of Sonic and of the other characters, they're extremely readable, extremely projectable because they're animal creatures. They're not even human. There's nothing to stand between you and the character, so to speak. With like a live action show, I struggle to watch a lot of live action shows because of the fact that, I don't connect with other people that easily. Just like I think for normies, just seeing a human is enough for them to connect with the character. It's why they don't necessarily need any more depth of the story, because they relate to it because it's human. Adam of Your Movie Sucks always makes fun of the fact that like regular people will just see a family and immediately it's, oh, I'm emotionally resonant with this, even though it has not justified itself. The family's not realistic. They're not fleshed out. The fact that he cares about that at all puts him at level, he's probably 1 or 2. I would probably say closer to 2. Most, I think, online critics, especially on YouTube, are like level 2 autism. I think critics who are more in the traditional publishing world are closer to level 1 for the most part, but you can gauge people. I assume that this video is going to spark nothing but people describing how autistic they think various people are. There's a lot of people who are going to be very mad at me for doing this, but I have great fun with it because I have no qualms about being a level 3 autist, bordering on level 4, I would say. I'm like in the interim between level 3 and 4. But hey, I've built a whole career on my autism, so whatever. But yeah, it's harder for me to instantly relate with something just because it has a human face. I might, look at something that has a more direct aesthetic appeal that speaks to me, not because it's a person, but because it is particular to my own interests, and that's what gets me deeper into the story. And I think that when you're at level 6, all it takes is just like that first image, the first thing that imprints itself on you. You can run with that forever. I think about something like Ulalilla, who there's a video about him circulating around on the internet, but I've known about him for a while. And he has this thing he does where he will take songs from Sonic and just take the same song and speed it up a little bit, and then a little bit more, and then a little bit more, and like that's all he listens to is like the same songs, just like at different speeds and different pitches, because he doesn't need more songs. He only needs the one that left an initial impression, and then he can enjoy it in so many different ways. It becomes his own creation. So that's where we get into the level 6, and it's why I think level 6 autists tend to have like these sort of inner worlds that they've built for themselves. These whole like database, and Ulalilla obsessively databases his own life, as that's what his whole website is based around. So which fascinates me, and I love to see it, but I can't relate to it. And like at level 6, because you are so deep into your own database, into your own world, your own realm, other people really struggle to relate. Level 6 autists do not relate to one another. They get sucked into their particular worlds, and everything is going on in their own heads. When you get down to levels 5 and 6, this is where like tulpamancy starts to really become a thing, where people hypnotizing themselves really becomes a thing. It's like, this is the level at which your own inner sanctum is your playground because the world makes no sense to you. It is too, it appears too complex because you're getting so much complexity out of even one thing that you don't know where to parse. You don't know where to draw the line. You don't know where to, stop thinking about this and move on to the next thing. The more autistic you are, the more single-minded and obsessed you tend to be. You fixate on something and you run it into the fucking ground. And people like me at level 3, I've obviously done this with anime. I'm single target obsessed with it and running it into the ground, But people who are at level 1 or who aren't autistic at all tend to have much less obsessive tendencies or to move on from things, Somebody who's level 1 or 2 autism might get really concentrated on something for a little while and then they forget about it and they don't care anymore, It comes up again and maybe they have some feelings, some, remembrance of the way they felt at the time. But somebody who's at level 6, whatever you latched onto when you were a kid, it never gets old. You're going to be thinking about that shit for the rest of your fucking life. Anyways, I think I've explained this all enough. All of this is in good fun, obviously. I'm not a scientist or a psychologist. I just like to say funny things and think about autism a whole lot. But you know what? I think if you look deep into your heart and think about how autistic you feel and what things you like and why you like them, you will find that there are a lot of nuggets of truth sprinkled into this. Maybe it's not truly an autism chart. That's just a word that is catchy and fun and made you click on the video and is a great way for us to, explore these ideas. But I definitely think there's something to this whole thing. And I think about people I know and people I know tend to have very consistent tastes when judged on this chart. The way they enjoy things tends to fall in line with this kind of database appreciation, with this sliding scale of sort of humanism versus databasism. And I didn't even get that much into the more emotional side of things just because it's more difficult to categorize how autistic something is emotionally. I think there are lots of stories that if you really like stories that don't speak as much in words as they do in images and feelings, that grows increasingly autistic and alien the further down you go. I think that, for instance, art house films tend to fall into, level 3 or deeper because they're exploring some kind of very particular feeling that, that normal people just don't even care about the idea of exploring. But you get fixated. You have these certain things that you feel this way, and then you really want to understand it, and you really want to burrow into those feelings and get it deeper. I would say a show like Hebe K. Euphonium is something that I consider level 2 autism on an emotional level. There's not a ton of complexity in the storytelling, but it's another show that's less about directly telling a compelling narrative and more about having lots of emotional depth in the characters. Revolutionary Girl Utena is definitely a level 3 autism show on both levels. It has tons of meta about the surrounding culture. It has tons of, different types of emotions, characters constructed out of combinations of ideas. So, here's just go wild. Think about it yourself. Propose to me what autism levels you think are of shows that I didn't talk about. I'll let you know how I feel. I'd love to eventually make some kind of visual chart for all of this. The reason I did this as a vlog is that I've been thinking about this all month. I talked about it on the PCP a few weeks back, but I really don't have time to sit down and make a huge infographic. If somebody wants to do that, and work with me on if there's any shows you're not sure how autistic they are, how would I categorize them, you want to work with me on it, I'd love to help you out, but I also want it to be visually good. So, don't try to fucking make this chart if you don't know how to make charts. But anyway, that's it for now. I'm working on my second volume of my light novel. Stay tuned for that. It's definitely a level... Is it level 2 or 3 autistic? I'm trying to... Volume 2 is going to be more autistic than Volume 1. Let's put it that way. So, look forward to that, and have a nice time.